Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is January 22nd, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start getting a little bit into the offseason, just talking about the big storylines as we head into it. Obviously, we'll get into a little bit more detail going into next week, but definitely wanted to give you guys just overall 50,000 feet kind of view of that. Then we'll get into Ohio State compared to the other CFP teams. It's been a huge question around social media the last couple of days. How would they fare against 2019 LSU, against 2020 Bama, against the Georgia teams? We'll break it down on today's show. Then we'll get to Ryan Day and the Ohio State future. This is a very young coach. There's no doubt about that. He's only 45 years old, just won his first national title, the youngest since Urban Meyer to do that. And now you got to look forward, and there's going to be a lot of really great things that can happen, and then obviously there's the bad scenario, possibly. But then we'll get to some questions coming out of the season. The big one going around is, did the regular season mean more or less this year? And I think there's an argument both ways. But then we'll get to my way too early 2025 top 10. Very tough list to put together. A lot of really good teams right around that 8 to 12 mark. I feel pretty good about the group that I have, but frankly, you can mess around with that a number of ways if you wanted to. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $, add any question, comment you like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that, and we can have fun back and forth. But let's go ahead and jump into this thing, and let's talk about the offseason. Let's talk about the offseason here for a second, because there's a lot of different things that are going to go on during this offseason. Now, some of them we will get to in time. There's going to be some infighting between these conferences. There's going to be some people battling in the revenue sharing space, but let's go ahead and jump into this, and let's start off with what's going to be the most obvious one, and the one that probably will happen in the next month or so if it's going to happen this year, which is CFP changes. This is one of the things that's been really talked about. Obviously, people have some issues with the CFP, and I'll get into that tomorrow, do some final pros and cons of the 12-team CFP, feel a little bit better about it than I did even a couple of weeks ago. So we'll get into that tomorrow, but the auto buy is not something that's going to be easy to get rid of. You have the Big 12, you have the ACC, and all the Group of 5 conferences that really want that to be a thing. It gives them a little bit extra money when they go to a bowl game compared to a road playoff game or even a home playoff game. They're going to make more money going to the Sugar Bowl, going to the Fiesta Bowl, going to the Orange Bowl. So that's obviously going to be a really relatively tough thing to get fixed out or get ironed out before the 2026 season, if I had to imagine. But the reseeding is a thing that could happen. Now, something to keep in mind with the reseeding is the same matchups would have happened this year. There would have been no real reseeding. There would have been no real changes because everyone pretty much played where they were supposed to play. We did have 5 through 8 get wins in the second round, but 5 played 8, 6 played 7. So it ended up working out relatively normally, and reseeding wouldn't have changed anything this year. It is something they'll probably look at going into next year if an 11 seed, let's say, beats a 6 seed, they should play the number 1 team in the country. They shouldn't play the number 3 team in the country, and the number 3 team in the country have a little bit of an off game. But obviously, that's something they're going to try to figure out. The selection process is another thing to watch as we head into next year, I think. For the most part, you're going to be watching those teams like Indiana, like SMU, that had really incredible years this year, and got into the field and definitely deserve to be in the field, but it'll be interesting to see how they handle that going forward. A team that maybe hasn't played the most aggressive schedule in the world, but has won a lot of football games. How do you weigh, How do you weigh that going forward over the next couple of years will be a very interesting thing to watch. So I don't know if anything's really going to change. I really don't know if there's going to be anything that concretely at least changes. The selection process and that type of thing could have some tweaks to it going into next year, and it really will with new people in that room. But overall, I think there's going to be a couple of tweaks here and there. You'll probably have to wait till 2026 to get real changes to the CFP, but definitely something to watch, especially over the next month or so as commissioners start to kind of meet a little bit more often. And yeah, I think the national championship conversation is a confusing one, Anthony. I think there's a number of different games that you could put there. I relatively like the rotating cast of bowl games being there, Rose Bowl and the National Championship, the Orange Bowl and the National Championship. But frankly, I would be more than fine if they just set up shop in Pasadena and did it there every year. I understand some people are not so into that, so it's a battle back and forth. I think we're fine for the time being doing it the way that we're doing it, but I do think there's a good opening to give it a little bit more majesty, give it a little bit more of that college football feel going forward, and that's obviously something that a lot of people, including Joel Klatt over at Fox, is really pushing for to make it the Rose Bowl. So I don't necessarily have one want or another, but it's definitely something that I'm thinking about. I'd lean towards making it a bowl game and kind of adding to that a little bit, but other than that, I don't necessarily have any aggressive opinions on whether a national championship would work. But for the revenue sharing questions, that's another thing to watch here, and that'll probably start to happen over the next month or so. Now, the big question here is Title IX is going to get involved, which means the government's going to have to get involved, whether that's Congress or Department of Education or a number of people are going to have to find a way to go forward with this, whether or not Title IX is fully involved, if it's partially involved, if it's going to, knock down the male budget all the way down to 50%, where it was going to sit around 90% for the male sports compared to the female sports. If it drops down to 50, then it's going to be an interesting conversation. There's going to be a lot of people pushing one direction, a lot of people saying, I really don't want that to happen. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. Right now, it looks like 75% of the 20.5 million would go to the football program. Then there's the Title IX question that would totally change this conversation and would definitely create a lot of different hoops for people to jump through. Not necessarily a terrible thing by any means, but definitely something kind of to watch as we move forward. But I think the Sugar Bowl would be incredible. New Orleans is such an awesome host, and it obviously gives a lot of energy to both fan bases. I think that would be a great place to set up shop in. The Xavier Lucas situation is something we can get into in a little bit more detail later in the week. I don't see anything that is evidence of Miami tampering. I haven't seen anything, at least concrete, that makes me feel like Miami broke any rules or really did anything out of the norm. Is definitely what happened here, no doubt about that. But I do think that it won't necessarily amount to anything. I don't think Wisconsin has too much stuff to really argue against this, but obviously we can get into that a little bit more probably on Friday to kind of give a little bit of update there and see where we stand, because maybe they have a little bit better of an argument than I think they do, but as I've seen it right now, there's not a ton of a leg to stand on for Wisconsin. But moving forward here, is the SEC coming back in 2025? That is the big time question, and I think there's a lot of different motivation down in that part of the country to find a way back, because I think we all understand the SEC is not used to being in this position. Even in the second position of the sport, they've sat up top for the last 15 years, and a lot of that was Saban. There's no doubt about that, but all those teams are very upset that they're not there anymore. So Kirby Smart in Georgia, I've talked about them a little bit. They look like a team that's really trying to go on a death march next year. They're trying to add all the talent they can at wide receiver, and they're doing a great job. Texas could be as good, if not better, than they were this year. Definitely want to be a little bit better, especially offensively. Kalen DeBoer will have his quarterback. LSU returns a ton. And then you got South Carolina, Tennessee, Florida, and a ton of other teams that really could make some things happen. So the SEC is going to occupy that number 2 spot going into the offseason. That's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. I think they'll occupy that really going through the next season. That being said, there are a number of teams that can make some big-time jumps. I think the Big Ten will have more top 5 teams next year. I think the SEC could have more top 15 teams, and then you just got to find your stride at the right time if you're an SEC team. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. But I tend to agree. I got to be totally honest. I think when you look at what Georgia has at quarterback with Gunnar Stockton, it probably feels a little bit safer than what Arch Manning is going to be. But at the end of the day, I've seen the talent level. I think I have to, lean towards that talent level, and I'll talk about that actually at the end of the show, get into what I think about that Texas team in a little bit more detail, but it'll be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that, and that's actually something we'll talk about. The young talent at quarterback taking over all around the country. This is the guy that'll get a lot of talk. Let's just be totally honest. He has that last name. He goes to the University of Texas. There's going to be a lot of talk around Arch Manning, but Oregon breaking in a new quarterback. So is Ohio State. Georgia, to a certain extent, is breaking in a new quarterback. Indiana had a guy transfer in, and then you got DJ Lagway at Florida. You got Lenora Sellers at South Carolina. Penn State, LSU, Clemson. Those are the guys with the veterans this year. Will that kind of get the tip the scales in their direction a little bit more, because Will Howard, Riley Leonard, ultimate professionals, ultimate veteran guys that led their teams to championships this year. Maybe that's a little bit more of an opening. And then you do have, Dante Moore, Julian Sain, CJ Carr, DJ Lagway, all are going to be really, really talented players. The question is, does the youthful nature of those guys really give them an advantage, or will it kind of come back to bite them? And then we'll see Clemson against Penn State in the national title, because they have the veteran talent at quarterback, where some other teams are breaking in some new guys, like we talk about Anthony with Arch Manning. A lot of pressure on that kid right away, and if he makes a couple of mistakes early, especially in that Ohio State game, a lot of angry fans. I can almost promise you that. Then you have teams bouncing back. That is going to be a huge talking point, and it feels forever since we talked about Florida State, for good reason, to be totally fair. But let's talk about Michigan first. That's the first team that came to mind for me. 7-5 this year, and you got the win over Ohio State. That's absolutely great. A huge step back from the mountaintop, and now you got Bryce Underwood coming in, and we talked about how much pressure Arch Manning is under. Bryce Underwood might be a very close second as we head into this year. He is the guy that Michigan fans want to turn around the program, and I don't know if he does that in the very first year, but Carson Beck's another veteran guy, and we'll see what that surgery does hold. That does add some questions into the mix, but definitely could be a guy that leads them to a CFP and maybe a national title. But for Florida State, Thomas Castellanos, Gus Malzahn coming into that offense, some really talented guys on that defense that walked out the door, some walked in the door, so that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. I think Mike Norvell goes into next year knowing that he's got to deliver in some way. I don't necessarily think it has to be an ACC title or anything crazy. I think he's got to take a pretty sizable step forward, maybe 9 wins next year. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. And then you got USC, you got Florida, some teams that were around 500 that would love to be a little bit better. Florida feeling pretty good going into 2025, unlike some of these other teams, but definitely a jump that USC wants to make big time going into the next year. And then this is the big time question, and the answer is very, very easy to me. If I'm being totally honest, it's a resounding yes. This is going to happen. The parity is going to continue in this sport because NIL is kind of making it that way. Now, I do think with revenue sharing, it's going to lean a little bit more towards the SEC and the Big Ten as we move forward, but the reality is you got young quarterbacks all over the place. And then you got a guy like Cade Klubnik up at Clemson that could really elevate what that team is. And the SEC, you have all young quarterbacks, really but Garrett Nussmeier, which is an entirely different set of skills and definitely gives them maybe a leg up on some of the younger talent out there. And then Penn State, Ohio State, or Penn State's the one that's really returning the veteran. Illinois is returning a veteran. It'll be really interesting to see what happens here. The ACC and the Big 12, I think they're going to be really good again next year. I don't necessarily think they're going to quite match up to what the SEC and the Big Ten have, although I think that Clemson team is downright special, and it's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. But I don't think the parity is ending anytime soon. I don't think it's going anywhere, and I don't think we're going to have to worry about that, if I'm being totally honest, because the talent level at some of these programs are getting better and better. A team like Clemson is getting better. A team like Miami is getting better. So I do think it's going to be really, really awesome to see how all of this kind of unfolds, and obviously, this is what we want in the sport. If you're not a big-time Big Ten or SEC fan, you obviously do want some parity, want some different teams getting into the mix, and I don't think that's changing anytime soon. But as far as the true freshman quarterback, or a true freshman in general, true freshman quarterback, Bryce Underwood's the guy that you're going to want to watch, at least as you head into spring, because he's the only one, at least as I can see it, that is guaranteed to start. Now, the one guy I will say, I think Keelan Russell could steal that Alabama job. I think he's that good. I think he has that ability, and I think he's a guy that is going to show up on campus and really jump up the boards pretty quickly. So I think that'll be an interesting name to watch. A couple other guys that could get their starting jobs right away, but the way that I see it, if you're going to want to watch a guy that is going to start, it's probably going to be Bryce Underwood. And then you have a guy like Keelan Russell that really could make some waves in spring over the next couple of months. But we'll break that down, obviously, as it unfolds. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, let's talk about Ohio State. Let's talk about how they match up against the other CFP champions. A lot of people saying that they're one of the best, if not the best team they've ever seen. I don't necessarily go that far, but we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the offseason storylines, a lot of different things going into this offseason, and we'll obviously break down some of the big time storylines as we get into next week, but let's talk about Ohio State. Let's talk about this 2024 team and how do they stack up to the other CFP champs has been a big time question as we head into the offseason and really as we just kind of measure these guys against each other, and it's kind of an interesting conversation because you do have the 12-team format, which has kind of informed a lot of these decisions, has kind of changed the way that we kind of look at the college football season and has changed some of the records that Ohio State broke throughout this year. But let's go ahead and jump in here. Remarkable season, obviously, remarkable team by every mean, and the one big storyline that they did have at the very end of the year was they won 5 games against top 5 teams in the country. They also beat number 2, 3, 4, 5, 9, and 10. When you talk about the final rankings of the AP poll, or of the CFP poll, excuse me, remarkable stuff from this group. They were absolutely incredible really throughout the season. Obviously, had the 2 blips against Oregon and against Michigan, and that definitely adds to this conversation just a little bit. They're also the second team in history, along with 2018 Oklahoma, that had a 3,000-yard passer, 2,000-yard rushers, and 2,000-yard receivers. Really remarkable offense, obviously, and Will Howard ends with the top QBR in the entire country. Really incredible team, and obviously a team that, talent-wise, can match up with a lot of the teams that we've seen in the past couple of years. There's no doubt about that. They're one of the more talented teams that I've ever seen. The question becomes, can they play that level of football continuously against some of these elite teams that we've seen in the past? And the other part of this, and the only real, I don't want to say issue, but the thing that I kind of have pause about when we talk about the most top 5 wins of all time and the 3,000-yard passer, 1,000-yard rusher, 1,000-yard receiver, the 12-team playoff helped them out a little bit. There's no doubt about that. They played the number 2, 3, 4, and 9 teams in the CFP tournament. Obviously beat them all. It was absolutely incredible to watch, but that obviously did help the top 5 wins, where a 4-team wouldn't have given you that 5th top 5 win. And then Emeka Egbuka, Quinshon Judkins, and Travion Henderson all went over 1,000 yards on Monday night. So it wasn't necessarily like they were over 1,000 yards going into the CFP, and then we're just adding on to that throughout the time. They got those extra couple of games. Now, they had to win those games, to be totally fair, and I think it is fair to say it's one of the most dominant runs we've seen because the 12-team playoff kind of necessitates that in a lot of different ways. So it's hard for me to say, without question, this is the best team that I've seen, because I look around at the 12-team and I don't want to say it aided this team by any means because they obviously had to win more games, but it did kind of aid their resume just a little bit. It did kind of add to some of the majesty of this team and some of the incredible things that they did do. They ended up doing because of the 12-team playoff, not necessarily in spite of it, not necessarily they had to battle through it. More, they got a little bit of more games to kind of play around with things, to kind of open up Jeremiah Smith and Emeka Egbuka and all those guys, and it obviously led to some really, really remarkable performances, but that's the big-time question. How do they match up to the other CFP teams? Because they were great this year. They were the best team in the country this year, I really think, from start to finish. Had a couple of bad moments, no doubt about that, but you watch this team at their top level, they were the best team in the country. That was relatively clear, but how do they match up against the other teams? How do they match up against the other, what I consider the 3 best teams that I've seen in CFP era? And that starts with, went one too far here, but that does start with 2019 LSU. This is a team that, it's the best team that I've ever seen. I'll be totally honest. It's a team that I think people are forgetting how good that defense ended up being. Now, didn't necessarily end up being world-beating or necessarily Ohio State's level this year, but you had Derek Stingley on the back end playing elite football. K'Lavon Chaisson was an absolute game wrecker off the edge by the end of the year, and Grant Delpit was an incredible center fielder at safety. So I think we talk about this team and there's so much, they just outscored everyone. They just made sure that they scored 50 points every game, and they did plenty of that. I'm not necessarily arguing that by any means, but their defense played the part that they needed to play. They were very opportunistic towards the back half of that season, and against a quarterback like Will Howard, who played incredible football throughout the last 4 games, but would necessarily struggle when you put him into tough positions. I think Dave Aranda could very well do that as the defensive coordinator. So I think this would be an incredible game. I think there would be a whole lot of points. If I'm being totally honest, I think there would be a ton of points. But at the end of the day, I do think there's going to be, I don't think this necessarily would go Ohio State's way. I think 2019 LSU is just that little bit more special. I think that 2019 LSU team would score a lot of points on this defense. As good as this defense is, as incredible as they are all across the field, this LSU team was just a little bit different. I think they would be a nightmare to guard for anyone in college football history, frankly. Then you got 2020 Alabama. The very next year, they were put on a very, very good run, and they obviously had an incredible offense as well. They had the Heisman winner with Devontae Smith at quarterback. They had John Mechie. They had Jalen Waddle for the early parts of that year, but Mac Jones was the guy running the show, and another incredible team. Najee Harris in that run game would be a little bit tough for Ohio State to fully stop, along with all this talent that they have on the outside. Steve Sarkisian and Joe Brady kind of went about it different ways when you talk about LSU and Bama, but both really, really aggressive offenses. Both offenses that will attack you in every which way, and both offenses that have speed that is just not able to really get prepared for. It's really one of those things where you play Devontae Smith, you play John Mechie, you can do everything you want to do. The reality is he's going to run around you every now and then. So I'd give the slight edge to Bama here. It'd be very, very close if I'm being totally honest, and I do think if they're both playing A-plus football, it would be an incredible game. But at the end of the day, I'd trust this Bama team just that little bit more, and really I trust Nick Saban a little bit more in a lot of different ways. But then you have the Georgia teams, and you can pick whichever one you want. I think 2022 was just that little bit better than that 2023 team because of that defense, and that's the big thing I want to talk about here. That UGA defensive line against this Ohio State offensive line, as good as they were, it's an entirely different conversation. That Texas defensive line did a really good job against that offensive line of Ohio State. They don't necessarily, they come close, but they're not necessarily what Georgia was in 2022. With Jordan Davis, with Jalen Carter, with all of those guys on that front seven, it was just going to be too much for this Ohio State team. So as good as they were, as good as Ohio State was, I think Will Howard's just having a nightmare in that game, if I'm being totally honest, especially with some of the guys coming off the edge that you would have with Nolan Smith, with a lot of these just ridiculously talented players. I think that offensive line would have a very bad day. Now, the outside matchups would be a really fun thing to watch. Jeremiah Smith against Keely Ringo would be two downright aliens going at it on the outside, so that would be incredible to watch. But again, I'd give the slight edge to 2022 Georgia. I'd lean towards that them in this in this respect. Definitely a really, really incredible team, and I think this Ohio State team is awesome. There's no doubt about that. I think they played 4 games that you could put them up against really anyone. But when I really get into it, when I really look at the entire season for this Ohio State team, I can't feel confident that they're going to beat a Kirby Smart, or they're going to beat a Nick Saban, or really they're going to beat a Dave Aranda. And Anthony, you make a great point that this 2020 Bama team was great at forcing turnovers. They were great at defense, and they were one of those teams that you could have all the ability in the world. They were going to kind of scheme you to death, and they did an incredible job throughout that year just kind of keeping teams at bay, and then that offense taking over, and I think that's how that game would unfold. So I'd give the slight lean to these 3 teams. Now, 2023 Georgia, we can have a different conversation. That's definitely a conversation to be had, but overall, incredible teams, all 3 that I'd give the slight edge over this Ohio State team. But why this team was special? Because there's a number of reasons why this Ohio State team was special, but the senior class was the reason, as far as I'm concerned. I've seen a lot of people go out there and say, they spent $20 million, so obviously you're going to win a national title. That is not how that works. I'll be totally honest with you guys, because if you want to know how that works, go down to Austin, Texas, go up to Eugene, Oregon, and ask them how that worked, because it didn't necessarily work in their favor, because they had to play this team, and they had to play this senior class, because you get the right guys in the building. It's not necessarily about it getting all the most talented guys, although Ohio State did a great job of that. But I do think there's going to be moments where we look back on this team and we say, okay, $20 million, insane amounts of talent, that's why they won. They won because this team was together. They won because Jack Sawyer and all those leaders on that defense and really across that senior class were incredibly important to keeping that team engaged throughout that really, really rough patch after that Michigan game. So you can build a $20 million roster. You're more than welcome to, and ask your team to. They're absolutely welcome, but the reality is they're not all built the same. This one was built very, very specifically and was built with Ohio State guys. I know they got a couple of transfers that really helped out a ton in some big-time ways, but at the end of the day, the special part of this team, the bedrock of this team, was the senior class in a lot of different ways. So a very, very special team. This was the biggest reason for it. And then obviously there were two absolutely game-changing talents on both sides of the field. There were Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs. Freaks, absolute freaks, both aliens in every single sense of the word. If Caleb Downs was not a freak, Texas is probably running a 4th and 4 instead of a 4th and 9 on that play. If Jeremiah Smith is not a freak, Notre Dame's probably getting the ball down 8 with about 3 minutes left in that game. So these two guys had a ton to do with what this team was capable of this year. Caleb Downs made them, it looked like there were 4 of that guy on the field. He was absolutely incredible the entire year. And then Jeremiah Smith, if you want to cover him one-on-one, you're more than welcome to. It is not going to work out for you 9 times out of 10. He's a very, very good wide receiver, obviously, and it's one of those things that you have all the talent in the world, you have all the leadership in the world. Sometimes you just need absolute game changers, and this is what those guys are. They're incredible, incredible players, and frankly, if they could go in the NFL draft this year, they'd both be top 10 picks. And then you had true pent-up anger. This is the last key to this team because they were really talented the entire year. They had that ability the entire year. They needed a little spark. They needed a little thing that got them all engaged, that got them all locked in and had them pushing in the same direction. It was this moment. It was the Michigan moment where they tried to plant a flag in your field and people fought back. There's no doubt about that. And we'll talk about that Michigan game in a little bit more detail tomorrow, or a little bit more detail even later in the show. The people saying that game didn't matter, I don't know what to tell you. If you watched the aftermath of that game and came away thinking it didn't matter, I don't know what to tell you. But at the end of the day, this is what this team needed. This is what Ryan Day needed in a lot of ways. And you saw his pregame speeches before these games. He was a little bit mad. He would definitely wanted to get that monkey off his back, and he did in a huge way. So that was a huge piece of this team. You know, you can have the talent, you can have the leadership, you can have everything in place. Sometimes you just need a little bit of a spark to get everyone fully locked in, to get everyone pulling in the same direction, and that's exactly what happened against Michigan on that day. They've been able to really find a way to all pull in the same direction. It's a terrifying thing when this team does that, obviously. But my overall take on this Ohio State team was downright special, and these last 4 games are about as good as I've seen a team make. Now, you go back one more game, it gets a little bit sketchy. There's no doubt about that. But you look back at 2019 LSU, 2020 Bama, what they did was insane. Bama beat number 13 A&M by 28 points, number 3 Georgia by 17, number 22 Auburn by 29, number 7 Florida by 6, and then beat Notre Dame by 17, beat Ohio State by 28 to get the CFP. It was a team that if you put them in a 12-team playoff, they're probably tearing everyone to pieces regardless of what you put in front of them. And then LSU beat number 9 Texas, beat number 7 Florida by 14, number 9 Auburn, number 3 Alabama, number 4 Georgia, and then just rolled through Oklahoma and Clemson to a national title. So it's really hard to top those two teams. And really that Georgia team back in 2022, I'd give the slight edge over this Ohio State team. I can't necessarily say this is the best team I've ever seen. I can say that they would give all those teams a good run for their money, especially if they're playing A-plus football. Now, we've seen them play C-plus football, and we've seen some of these other teams not necessarily do that, so that is kind of where the pause really comes in for me. But overall, incredible team, no doubt about that, an elite team, just not an elite year by any means. And I think you look back on that, even as an Ohio State fan, you got the national title. That's obviously the ultimate thing you want, but not necessarily the elite year because you got 1 out of the 3 goals that you put out there every single year. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch as we head into 2025, but incredible year for Ohio State. Not quite the team that 2019 or 2020 Bama, or 2019 LSU or 2020 Bama was, but incredible team nonetheless, and we'll see if they can build off that. And that's actually what we'll talk about next segment. We'll take our second break here. When we come back, we'll talk about Ryan Day and the incredible roster he's built, the incredible job he's done the last couple of years, and what the future could hold with him in Ohio State right after this. So stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about Ohio State and how they measure up to the other big-time CFP teams that we've seen throughout the last couple of years. I don't think they're quite to 2019 LSU, quite to 2020 Bama, even quite to 2022 Georgia. They are very close to those groups. And if you played them A-plus football, it would be an incredible thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. But let's get into Ryan Day and let's talk about what he's done at Ohio State this year. And Anthony, you make a very interesting point that a lot of different people make, that Urban Meyer kind of built this roster. Urban Meyer put all the pieces into place. Ryan Day would just had to execute the job. And there is an argument for that. I'm not necessarily saying you're entirely wrong. I do think there is a little bit of a, I don't want to say misunderstanding, but I think when you look at the sport right about now, you got to recruit your guys every single year. So yes, technically he did not get them to officially sign with Ohio State. All those guys could have walked out the door when Urban Meyer did. All those guys could have said, I don't want to play for Ryan Day, but they stayed, and they stayed again. And then obviously Jack Sawyer and JTT and all those guys that very well could have left had to essentially be recruited back to this program. So while he didn't necessarily put those guys on the roster to begin with, keeping those guys intact is a very hard thing to do this time of college football world, and you're in a position where you did a great job doing it. Obviously, it's not necessarily all his players necessarily, but a whole lot of them are. And frankly, all of them would tell you that even if Urban Meyer was, or even if it was Ryan Day taking over and going somewhere else, they love this guy and they want to play for this guy almost no matter what. So there's an argument to be had, no doubt about that, Anthony. But I do think when we look at Ryan Day, we have this propensity to sort of discount what he's been able to do because he coaches at Ohio State and because he has the talented team that he does. And there's no doubt that plays a big role in this. Having the talent is a big part of the battle in college football. If you don't have the talent, you're not going to have a shot to win. And that's something we can talk about in a little bit more detail going forward. But overall, the big time sentiment out there has been, in some different ways, the $20 million question. You spent $20 million. What else are you supposed to do other than win a national title? But the reality is it's really hard to win a national title regardless of what you have on the field. That's the reality of the situation because Steve Sarkisian, Dan Lanning, and a lot of other guys spent a whole lot of money on their rosters. I can absolutely promise you that. And they're in the process of spending a whole lot of money on their rosters right about now. So you put them in a position where they had a $20 million roster. So did Steve Sarkisian, so did Dan Lanning, so did a lot of other programs in this CFP world, and a lot of programs in the past that you just can't talk about because you would burn a lot of bridges if you were to talk about them. So the $20 million part of this roster is not overly special. It's not necessarily the crazy thing about this team. The crazy thing about this team is where you spent the money. It's who you gave the money to, and it's who you pushed the money towards. And it was Jack Sawyer, it was JTT, it was Travion Henderson, it was all these guys that not only were incredible talents and were going to make play after play for you, they were the guys that were the heartbeat of the team. They were the guys that understood what Ryan Day wanted to do, understood what being an Ohio State Buckeye was, and I totally get it. All of that is kind of grandiose and hard to kind of put our finger on, but the reality is it does mean something. There's no doubt about that. I think we're in a position where Ryan Day has done just an incredible job with this program and has put in a position where, yes, he was born in a better position than a lot of other coaches. But you look around at some of these other programs, a lot of these people were born in positions where they were going to have a leg up, where they were going to have a little bit more talent than the other guy around the corner, and a lot of guys fall on their faces. Let's just be totally honest. A lot of guys do not have the ability to bounce back from what he's had to bounce back from and deal with a lot of the things he's had to deal with. So people seem to have it sort of out for Ryan Day, and I'm not necessarily saying that anyone is totally unjustified for going after Ryan Day for different parts of his career and different mistakes that he's made, and especially that Michigan game, no doubt about that. But The reality is, this is a very, very good head coach. This is a very good man. It seems that everyone around his program really loves him and they want to play for him. They wouldn't have came back if they didn't. But at the end of the day, it's a job that is very unforgiving. It is a job that, frankly, Ryan Day doesn't need an apology. He doesn't need people to crawl over each other and say, I'm so sorry, saying you couldn't win the big one. But it's a remarkably hard job to do. And you talk about the elite jobs in this country, they're all incredibly hard. Steve Sarkisian is dealing with a whole lot of mess over there at Texas that a ton of coaches would not be able to handle. Ryan Day is dealing with things that a lot of coaches would not be able to handle, and you add Kirby Smart to that mix. You add Kalen DeBoer to that mix. You add all of the other guys at big-time jobs. It's a very, very hard thing to do, just overall. So I understand the criticism of Ryan Day. I'm not necessarily telling you guys you have to love Ryan Day going forward and he's the greatest man on earth. I do think he's a guy that gets more disrespect than he should. I think he's a guy that we don't necessarily give the credit to that we should because he's got Ohio State on his chest, and I totally get that. It's an incredibly, incredibly big job, and you should succeed there. You should compete for national championships, and at some point you should win one. That's the reality of that job. But the job that he has done since he's taken over for Urban Meyer has been really incredible. It's not been perfect. It's been far from perfect in a lot of different ways, but he's built this team up in a really remarkable way, and although a lot of those guys did come in with Urban Meyer, did sign for an Urban Meyer team, they had to sign on every single year for a Ryan Day team, and they were able to do that. They did do that, and you're absolutely right, Anthony. It is one of the hardest jobs to coach, but he joins an elite group this past week with Kirby Smart and Dabo Swinney, the only active head coaches with a national title to their name. Remarkable stuff, and definitely puts him in a echelon that I don't think a lot of people had him in as we head into the next decade or so. But overall, an incredible run from him. A remarkable team, a coach that has been much maligned throughout his career and really throughout the last year. Incredibly talked about and not necessarily in the greatest of ways, but he found his way to the mountaintop. And now you look at a resume that's just absolutely incredible. 70 and 10 throughout his career, third highest winning percentage among all head coaches that have coached at least 50 games. That is CFP national champion, the youngest since Urban Meyer back in 2006, 2 Big Ten titles, 2 national title appearances, 4 CFP appearances. He has a winning record against top 5 and top 10 opponents. So I understand. There's a lot of different things that Ryan Day has not done, and that big-time thing at the end of the year, he's got to get done. There's no doubt about that. He knows that as well as anyone, but the job that he's done at this school has been downright incredible. There's no doubt about that, and I think you look around the country, you can find guys like Kirby Smart. You can find guys that have more championships that I think are better coaches in a lot of different ways. I also don't think the gap between him and Ryan Day is this massive, massive thing, and I think Ryan Day's job that he's done this year, although he has all the talent in the world, is a very, very hard job to do. But how the future will play out is a very interesting question, and I think you got to start with there will be more title chances for this team. There's no doubt about that. This is going to happen because it's happened at least 4 times in the past for him where you were about a play or 2 away from the national title or you were in the national title. So this is going to happen. No matter what, this is going to happen. This is what Ohio State is. So Ryan Day is only 45 years old. He could coach for another 15 or 20 years at Ohio State, and he could have another 5-7 national title chances. Who knows? But remarkable head coach and definitely has plenty of different chances to raise that trophy in. Maybe we'll be able to catch Kirby Smart here in a couple of years. Maybe we'll be able to catch Dabo Swinney if one of those guys doesn't steal one from him over the next couple of years. A Michigan win is coming at some point. I can almost promise you that. Now, I don't know when it happens. It might be next year. It might be 2026. It might not be either of those years. It is going to happen. He's too good of a coach. He has too much talent to work with. He has too good of a staff to work with for this not to happen at some point. I do think something flipped in him in this year. Now, I can't say that with absolute confidence until we see what he does in that game. Obviously, that is a big-time question, and we'll see what happens in that game in 2025. But I think something flipped. I think he's a not entirely different coach, but a little bit of a different coach than he was before that game, and I think he's going to come into that game ready to roll in 2025. I can't promise that, and obviously that will be a big-time question in 2025, but it is coming at some point. I assume you will beat Michigan at least one more time in your history at some point, especially with Ryan Day as the head coach. And then you could have a dynasty-type run. This is very much on the table, and it's in large part because of the guy standing right next to him in Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs coming back for another year. Obviously, you have some things to figure out. Julian Sain has to come in and play really good football right away. I'm not saying you're going on a Bama type run. I want to make that very, very clear. It's not going to be a crazy run from this Ohio State program because I don't know if that's necessarily possible going forward. But at the end of the day, this is a team that's going to have every chance in the world. We talked about the 12-team playoff and how it's going to give teams like Ohio State, like Texas, like Georgia, more shots to get into this thing and then make a run. That was a 10-2 Ohio State team. When they walked in the door, they walk out 14-2, they walk out national champions, so they're going to have plenty of chances at this thing, especially in the 12-team and then 14, 16-team playoff. They're going to have tons of chances at this thing, and a dynasty-type run is not necessarily off the table for this team by any means. But it's going to be interesting to watch what happens here. Anthony, I don't think anyone, I don't want to say comes close. I think people will come relatively close to what Nick Saban did. I don't think anyone's getting 7, if I'm being totally honest. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch, and this might be your best chance at it, is Ryan Day being only 45 years old. But the elephant in the room is he's 1-4 against Michigan, and I totally get that that is a huge part of this game. The one question that I do have for people whenever they say that is, if the 3 losses were to Purdue, Illinois, and Nebraska, would we look at him much better? And I tend to believe that we would. And they're worse losses than that Michigan one. All 3 of those that I just named. So that'll be an interesting conversation. That's obviously something to talk about, and I'm not naive. I understand that that is the game. That is the game that everyone wants to win, and the reality is he's done an incredible job outside of that game. You got to win that game. There's no doubt about that, and he fully understands that as well. But overall, anything below 3 in the head coaching rankings, I think, is just too far. Now, we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next segment, but he joins Kirby Smart and Dabo Swinney as the only head coaches with a national championship that are active. It's a remarkable job. You know, it's a job that is not necessarily super easy to do. It's a job that a lot of people would convince you is very easy to do, and a lot of people would convince you that if you don't win a national championship, you're downright terrible. That's relatively never the case. It wasn't the case when he lost the national title to Alabama. It wasn't the case when he missed out on the national title to Georgia. It hasn't been the case when he's lost to Michigan in the past. Now, he's got to get that fixed, and he fully understands that, and I think he's going to. I think he's too good of a head coach. I think he has an incredible track record, and more than anything, you know, we talk about the accolades on the field all we want. What he's done for those kids has been incredible. Those guys don't come back if they don't have full trust in what he's building, don't have full trust in what he is and who the person that he is. He's done an incredible job with that team. So Jack Sawyer, JTT, Travion Henderson, all of those guys, they could be playing in the NFL playoffs right now. They could be getting ready for a big-time matchup this upcoming weekend. Instead, they came back to play for that guy in this program and this uniform, and that does matter in a lot of different ways. So maybe Ryan Day's job wasn't quite as hard as some other jobs in the past. There's no doubt about that because the talent level was absolutely ridiculous when he walked in the door. He's done a great job keeping that talent level really high. He's done a really good job, you know, continuing to keep them at the very forefront of the national conversation, and he's put them in a position to win a national title, and he very well will put them in a position to win a number of others before he's done. So, remarkable head coach. I think the future has plenty to hold for this only 45-year-old right about now, so going to be incredible to watch what he can do, and this year might just be the start of what Ryan Day is building in college football. But let's take our third break here, and when we come back, let's get some questions coming out of the season. The big-time one is, did the regular season mean more or less this year? And that's a big-time debate, and I think there's an argument on both sides, but we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone, and you're right, Anthony, I did forget just how good that defense was for Alabama in 2020. Definitely kind of the separating factor between them and this Ohio State team, although that Ohio State defense was very good as well. So would be a very, very fun game. I think would fit a lot of different molds. You know, it could be an absolute shootout between those offenses, could be a slugfest between those defenses, but I think the 2019 LSU team, that's going to give you points. The 2022 Georgia team, that's going to give you something like 14-10. And then Alabama will be somewhere in the middle if I had to imagine. But let's get to some postseason questions. There's some big-time things to talk about as we come out of this year, and one of the bigger ones is just how much did this season matter? How much did the regular season in particular matter as we moved into the CFP? And there's a good argument both ways as far as I'm concerned. And I think when you look at the CFP, you had two teams face off that wouldn't have been in the 4 team, wouldn't have been in the BCS for sure, and would have been in the position where you lost games, and it wouldn't have been anyone's fault but their own. They would have Notre Dame would have lost that NIU game. Michigan would have beaten Ohio State, and you look forward and say those teams probably don't deserve a chance to play for a national title. Obviously, they got that chance this year, and that's kind of the big time argument. You had 2 games that hypothetically should mean a ton, especially that Michigan loss to Ohio State should mean a lot. It didn't necessarily mean too much. Now, what I will push back on is that game didn't matter at all, because I would make a very good argument that if Ohio State did not lose that Michigan game, they probably don't win a national title, because I think certain things happened in that locker room that had to happen over the last month that probably wouldn't have happened if they had beaten Michigan by 7 points, by 3 points. So it is going to be a really interesting thing to watch. There is no doubt about that. But overall, I think when you look at this regular season, yes, there were certain games that were less important, quote unquote. The NIU game was quote unquote less important. So was the Michigan game at the end of the year. But you look over at the Big 12, there were tons of games that were important. There were tons of fan bases that were very much engaged in what the season was, as the season was going on, that wouldn't have been engaged halfway through October, especially into November. There was going to be a lot of people that checked out because their team didn't have a chance in the CFP. Now, I don't necessarily totally identify with that. I think the reality is you give these games what the importance that, or the games have the importance that you give them. So I think we put more emphasis on the regular season. The players will, and they will have more energy in these games, and they'll mean more hypothetically. Maybe they won't mean more in terms of a CFP. They obviously do mean something. You saw the reaction from Notre Dame after they lost that game. You saw the reaction from Ohio State after they lost that game. These games really do mean something. Obviously, they're not necessarily the disqualifying factor that they used to be in. We can have an argument, whether they should or shouldn't, because I think there's a good argument both ways on that as well. But overall, it matters to these guys. So the regular season, as much as it, mattered or didn't matter as you talk about the CFP, it mattered to these guys. And I think that's the most important thing, and that's the thing that we have to highlight just a little bit more often in this sport, is not the CFP tie-in. It's not the, way that this game totally changes the way the CFP plays out, just the way that this changes the way this season plays out for these kids, and the way that these kids really care about every last game that they play. So I fully understand this conversation. I totally get that in some ways it meant more, in some ways it meant less, but I do think there's moments in this regular season where you look back and you say, there was a lot of great out of that thing. And overall, the regular season, whether it meant more or less for the CFP, I think it meant plenty throughout this year. So there's a great argument there. Definitely going to be an interesting thing to watch. And yeah, so Anthony, there's a lot of different changes that are being discussed, and the conference champion getting into the Final Four, getting into the quarterfinals has been a big part of that conversation. I don't think it's going to change next year. I do think there will be a little bit more conversation around some of those teams, especially the at-large teams from the ACC or the Big 12 as we move forward. But overall, I don't see the conference champion thing changing all that soon. It could change in the next couple of years. Maybe in 2026 they have enough on the table for those teams to say that's more than fine, but it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. They're going to want to keep that auto bid at the very least. The auto buy is a little bit more of a precarious situation. Was the national title too late this year? This is a very real conversation, and one that was had by a lot of people leading up to this game that just didn't feel like a national title day. And I kind of felt that as well. There wasn't this massive energy around the college football season. We were coming off a remarkable divisional round from the NFL that got a lot of attention throughout the weekend, and we got into Monday, and a lot of people kind of remembered that there was a national title that day. So it's one of those things that I'll get into kind of early next week, talk about some of the different solutions for this, how they could kind of change the calendar to kind of make this a little bit better. I do think you do have to push it up. So I do think you have to figure out, maybe moving the season up 1 week, maybe playing CFP games on that Army-Navy weekend. I don't love that, I'll be totally honest with you, but I understand where they're coming from, and as long as Army-Navy have that standalone game, I wouldn't necessarily be overly upset, but it is something that I do think needs to happen. I think you're a little bit too deep into 2025 as you play that national title now. Those players don't necessarily care, there's no doubt about that, but it's going to be a little bit of a tightrope walk to see how you kind of move this thing up without crunching everything down and giving these guys no bye weeks, but you got to find a way to move it up just a little bit. If I had to imagine, at least before that divisional round for the NFL, because that takes up a lot of oxygen in the room. Then we got Ohio State. Did they get here in spite of or because of the Michigan loss? And I'd argue it's because of. I think that Michigan game played a huge role in what this Ohio State team was down the stretch, more from a mentality perspective than anything else. Losing to Michigan for this senior class that in large part came back to beat that team. You know, they came back obviously to win a national title, and they were able to do that. But all those seniors are now leaving this program with no wins over that team, and that made them very mad. There's no doubt about that. If Ohio State beats Michigan, let's say Jack Sawyer takes that pick back to the house, they win 17-13. Do they make the adjustments? Are they as aggressive of a team when they play Tennessee or when they play Oregon or when they play Texas or Penn State or in Notre Dame? But also, are they even in the position to play those teams? If they beat Michigan, they're going to the Big Ten Championship playing Oregon, and then they could be in the Penn State spot, they could be in the Texas spot, they could be the number 1 seed overall. So you would have been in a position where maybe the energy about this team wouldn't have been quite right. Maybe the intensity of this team wouldn't have been quite right if the terrible thing didn't happen. As crazy as that sounds, the Michigan loss is obviously something you never want to take and obviously something that they'd love to give back right about now, but the reality is I do think it flipped a switch in a lot of these players' minds where they said, we're not being denied anymore. I do think that totally changed what this team was, and I think they won the national title in a large part because of that Michigan loss and the way that it changed these players. Was this the toughest run in college football history? And I think the answer is yes here. Now, the question is more, is it tougher or is it just longer than some of the other ones out there? So you have Tennessee, Oregon, Texas, Notre Dame. Beating those 4 teams in a row is as impressive as just about anything I've seen in college football. There's no doubt about that. But if you put LSU in front of that CFP path, do they roll through them? If you put Bama in front of that CFP path, do they roll through them? So, Ohio State did an incredible job throughout this tournament run, and I will say the number 9 team, number 3, 4, and then number 2 team in the country on their way to a title is incredibly tough. There's no doubt about that, but I do think there is a question of if it happens next year. Let's say Texas is in this position and they are the 8 seed and they go on a run to win the national title. Is that now the best run in college football history? And then the year after that, and then the year after that. So that's kind of the big worry for me, and that's the thing that is giving me a little bit of pause with this 12-team playoff is all the runs are going to be tough because that's the reality of the 12-team playoff. Where does Ryan Day rank in college football head coaches? We talked about this a little bit in the last segment, so I won't spend too much time here, but 7-10 in his career, national title winner, and is only 45 years old, as crazy as that sounds. In my mind, he's the second best head coach in this game. I think, frankly, I probably would have put him top 3, top 4 right before the CFP. He is obviously elevated over the last couple of games. I would argue Kirby Smart is still number 1 in the game. Those back-to-back championships are a huge thing for him, and obviously is still at the very top of his game. If you want to put Dabo Swinney above him, I wouldn't necessarily go against you too much on that one, but I do think, as a lot of people think, that Dabo Swinney might not quite be the top of his game as he was back in the day, but overall, fantastic head coach. There's no doubt about that. He is a top 5 head coach before this run. To me, he is a very, very solidly a top 2 head coach after it. Now, you could make the argument that he should be 3, that he should be 4. I don't know if you can make the argument they should be anything lower than 5, if I'm being totally honest. Remarkable head coach and obviously at the top of the mountaintop right now. And then we got to ask, is the Big Ten's run going to continue into 2025? And this is something we'll get into in a little bit in more detail tomorrow. But 2025, you look forward in, you got a lot of really good teams. Oregon, Ohio State, Penn State, all setting up for huge years. You have Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, a couple of these other teams that really look like they're setting up for fantastic years as well. So it's going to be an interesting thing to watch. You look at the formula that Michigan had in 2023 that Ohio State had this year. Penn State kind of has that in 2025. Now, I don't know if they're quite the teams that those teams were, at least from a talent level, but they're definitely up there. And they're definitely a team that could make that type of run and give the Big Ten 3 consecutive national championships for the first time since 1940 to 1942. So the SEC has a ton of big-time teams. And maybe the best team in the country going into next year with Texas, but overall, the Big Ten has a ton of teams up at that top end. I think they will be the best conference in 2025, at least going into it. I don't think the gap is massive by any years, kind of the same way with this year where the SEC might be a little bit, I don't want to say deeper, but might have a little bit more teams that can compete for a CFP spot, but the Big Ten might have more teams that can compete for a national title spot. So the Big Ten is going to be awesome. They have 3 teams in my top 5 that we'll go through here in a second going into next year, but the SEC is going to do everything they can to bounce back next year to knock them off that pedestal. They have all the ability in the world to do that. There's no doubt about that, but the Big Ten's run, as far as I see it, is going to carry over at least a little bit into 2025. Will it go throughout the entire year? Is a conversation that can be had, and definitely will be an interesting thing to watch unfold, especially over the offseason as some of these younger quarterbacks in the Big Ten, how do they fare early on, and will definitely inform what we think about them going into the 2025 season. But let's get into that a little bit. My way too early top 10 for the 2025 season, very tough to put together. A lot of teams right around that 7 to 12 mark or 7 to 13 mark. I feel pretty good about the group that I have right about now, so we'll talk about it right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the questions as we head into the postseason. Obviously a lot of big time ones, and we'll probably expound on a couple of those as we go through the next couple of days, but it is time to get in my way too early top 25 or top 10 for the 2025 season, and it's a very, very tough list to put together. I think you're doing a lot of projection whenever you do these lists, and you're doing a lot of just who you trust, who you believe in the most as you head into the 2025 season. There's a lot of teams on here, or there's a couple of teams on here that I'm a little bit nervous about, but I love the upside of them, and it starts with number 10. South Carolina is my number 10 team as we head into 2025, and this team is going to be the darling of the offseason, and I will hop on that hype train with everyone else. The big question I do have is losing Dowell Loggins. The talent level is going to be a little bit down, especially on the defensive line. So there are questions about this team. There's no doubt about that, and there's some things that need to be ironed out. But I think Lenore Sellers is a downright incredible player. I think he's a guy that is really going to set the world on fire next year. Getting Mazio Bennett on the outside back is huge. Having Nick Harbor on that team is going to be huge. They got Rushul Faison from that portal. That's a fantastic player coming over from Utah State. And then you have Dylan Stewart, an absolute freak of nature on the defensive side of the ball. Getting Jalen Kilgore back on the back end of that defense is huge. There's going to be some replacement doing on this team. There's no doubt about that. There's going to be some guys that they're going to have to find replacements for, mainly TJ Sanders and Kyle Kennard on that defensive line. But it's hard for me to look at what Lenore Sellers did to end the year and not love this team going into 2025. So really love what South Carolina's building. I think they're very well could be a CFP team in there in 2025. Then I got Illinois here at number 9. This is a team that I think is going to be really good in 2025. They are losing Pat Bryant and Zachariah Franklin, but they were able to pick up Hudson Clement from the portal. They obviously got the incredible running back duo of Lockery and McCray. Remarkable group on the offensive side of the ball. And then Luke Altmaier to call all the shots in his third year actually at Illinois. He's done an incredible job this last year. I think he's going to elevate that little bit of more in 2025 and get that offense to that next little level that they very much need to hit. And then on defense, you're getting Gabe Jackas, you're getting Matthew Bailey, and a ton of other guys back on that defense. This is a team that I think is going to be in the CFP in 2025, at least as of right now. Obviously, the spring can change some of this type of stuff, but overall, really love what this Illinois team has, and I think they're a team kind of like Indiana last year or this year that could really burst onto the scene in 2025. This LSU team, I am buying in on again. I'll be totally honest, I'm a sucker for this LSU team just about every year, but feel pretty good about it this year. Garrett Nussmeier's coming back is absolutely massive. Obviously has a couple of turnover issues he does need to figure out, but overall, the talent level is about as good as anyone you're going to find in the country. Having Caden Durham, having Aaron Anderson, and then you bring in a guy like Barry Brown. You bring in Nick Anderson on the wide receiver group. You bring in Patrick Payton as an edge rusher. It's going to be a much better defense in 2025. If I had to imagine, I think Blake Baker will be able to really sink his teeth into that thing. The back end will be a lot better in. The pass rush will have that really special athlete that they very much need. I think this LSU team is going to be awesome. Now, the offensive line is a little bit of a worry for me, but getting a guy like Josh Thompson to kind of stabilize things is huge, and I think they're in a position where they could very well win the SEC in 2025. Love this team and really love that quarterback in Garrett Nussmeier. Notre Dame here at 7. Notre Dame turns over the keys to CJ Carr, and the good news is the cupboard is full for him. They got Jeremiah Love and Jadarian Price should be back for 2025, as should Jaden Greathouse and Jordan Faison on the outside. They're going to have plenty of talent on that offense, and they obviously got the left tackle. When you talk about Anthony Knapp going into his sophomore year, they're going to be more than fine offensively. Now, there's obviously the worry of a young quarterback. I think he's a game-changing quarterback and will be great going into 2025, but that obviously is a question until he steps on the field. There's no doubt about that, but the talent level will be remarkably high. The defensive pieces they're replacing are huge. You know, Xavier Watts is a massive player, not only for the plays that he makes, but obviously the communication that he has on the back end. So I'm a little bit worried about that defense just replacing all of the huge leadership positions, not necessarily the talent level, but the leadership that they had on that defense was massive, and I think replacing that's going to be really tough. But love this team going into 2025, and I think that talented running back duo can carry them right back where they were this year. This is a Clemson team that I absolutely love. I am buying every bit of Clemson stock that people are selling in. LSU gets to play them in week 1, so that'll be a really fun week 1 matchup. We'll get into week 1 tomorrow. It's absolutely incredible going into next year. But TJ Moore, Bryant Wesco, Antonio Williams will all be back with Cade Klubnik throwing him the ball. It's going to be a special offense. This is a group that we saw against Texas, made that really good defense and look not so good at different times throughout that game. Cade Klubnik can elevate that next level and get inside that Garrett Riley offense just that little bit more and possibly lead them to another CFP. They are losing pieces defensively, no doubt about that, but returning Sammy Brown, returning Wade Woodaz, returning TJ Parker, Peter Woods, and Avian Terrell, they're going to be more than fine on that side of the ball. And then you bring in a guy like Tom Allen to call the plays. This is a downright title contender as far as I'm concerned. A very, very good team, and Dabo started to hit the right buttons for that team to get that next little level. You know, pick up a couple of guys in the portal, get that one coordinator hire that you wouldn't normally hire in Garrett Riley and Tom Allen, and now you move forward as one of the best teams in the country as far as I'm concerned. Oregon here at number 5, they are turning it over to a new quarterback in 2025, but I really like Dante Moore. I'll be totally honest with you. I have a ton of faith in what this kid can do in 2025. I think that offensive line is a question for me. Those 2 offensive tackles that are walking out the door are incredible, incredible players. They have the talent to fill that. There's no doubt about that, but probably don't have quite the experience that you want to fill that position. Will be an interesting thing to watch. No doubt about that. Getting Evan Stewart back on the offensive side of the ball is massive for a young kid that just needs that kind of security blanket out there, and you got some portal guys that you're going to bring in, no doubt about that, in the spring, and this is going to be a team that's going to contend. There's no doubt about that. The talent level is going to be absolutely incredible. Mateo Uyunglele, I think, could be maybe the best defensive player in the country next year, and I think this offense is going to be more than fine with Will Stein and Dante Moore. This Georgia team is one that's going to be really interesting to watch as we go throughout the offseason. I think Kirby Smart is attacking offense in a way that he really hasn't before. In a lot of different ways, he is going after this thing in a really, really aggressively. You have Zachariah Branch coming in. You have No Thomas coming in. That would be 2 guys that you really wouldn't touch, if I'm being totally honest. Georgia 3 years ago probably doesn't go out and get those guys, probably isn't willing to spend the money to go get those guys. Now they're more than willing to do that, and I think that could be the thing that turns this season around, or turns the 2025 season around for this team, because you need that deep ball. You need the guys on the back end to really kind of scare you, and Zachariah Branch does that and more. It's definitely a very, very impressive team, and I think you look at the offense, it should be more explosive in 2025. It should have a little bit more ability, especially on the outsides. Now, will Gunnar Stockton be able to execute at the level that Carson Beck did is a question that definitely will have to be had. But at the end of the day, a ton of talent offensively that hasn't quite been there in the last couple of years. And then you look at the defensive side of the ball. the linebacker talent, the DB talent is just ridiculous on this team that is coming back, and especially with Dalen Everett returning for another year, you have a lot of talent in those two rooms. I think CJ Allen's a downright star just waiting to explode. I think Raylan Wilson's going to be incredible. I think Chris Cole is going to be absolutely awesome. So overall, the defense is going to be more than fine. I was a little bit worried about the DBs going into the offseason, but getting Dalen Everett's back is huge. I think KJ Bolden's going to be a massive player for this team. And overall, I think when you look at 2025, I think they're pushing the right buttons right now. I think they're getting the wide receiver talent that they've lacked in the past couple of years. I think they have a quarterback that can really push it down the field, and I think they got a lot of things to figure out defensively, but they got the talent back that they very much needed in CJ Allen and Dalen Everett. I think they're going to be a really terrifying team in 2025. Ohio State here at number 3, they're losing tons of guys. I don't need to tell you guys that. It's obviously going to be a ton of guys walking out the door. They also might have the 2 best players in the country going into 2025 when you look at Jeremiah Smith and Caleb Downs. I think it's the best offensive player in Jeremiah Smith. I think it's the best defensive player in Caleb Downs. And now you move forward with Julian Sain. That's the big-time question. Is he the guy that's going to be able to lead you back to the CFP and possibly back to another national title? It's going to be a question. There's no doubt about that. You're losing a lot of talent. There's going to be plenty of talent in that room, obviously, but bringing in guys like Max Clare and CJ Donaldson from the portal were absolutely massive. I think this is going to be a really good team. I think the defense gives me some pause. There's no doubt about that, but I love what Kenyatta Jackson can do. I think Caleb Downs obviously will kind of mask a lot of the issues that they might have on that back end, and overall, I think it's going to be a really, really good team. I think it's a team that we've seen time and again has been able to reload, has been able to add guys to what is already a very talented team. This will be a big-time job. There's no doubt about that, but I think they'll be more than fine in 2025, and I think that defense, although they're losing a ton of guys, will be plenty talented and plenty good in 2025. Penn State is my number 2 team right about now, and it's really not because of the veteran quarterback. As much as that is a big deal for me, and no doubt about it, I think they could follow kind of that 2023 Michigan path in a lot of different ways. Getting back Nick Singleton, getting back Katron Allen, and especially getting back Dani Dennis Sutton on the defensive side of the ball is huge. There's no doubt about that. Those are 3 guys that can totally change what you do in a season, can totally change the way the teams defend you, and can open a lot of doors for a guy like Drew Aller to throw the ball downfield. And you've added some guys. You got Kyron Hudson from USC. You got Devontae Ross from Troy, 2 very talented guys. You also lost Harrison Wallace. You lost Amari Evans. You lost, obviously, Tyler Warren. Going to be a little bit of a rebuilding group, and they're probably going to have to add a couple more guys in that spring portal class if I had to imagine. Now, what I will say is I love Luke Reynolds as you head into 2025. I think he's going to be a downright special player, and I think he's a guy that could totally take over this offense in a lot of different ways. You're going to need more help in the wide receiver group. You had a freak show at tight end this year, and it obviously didn't open up things enough. So you're going to need some help at the wide receiver room. I love what Kyron Hudson brings. I think they might need a little bit more than him and Devontae Ross to really get this thing the way that it really should be. My number 1 team is the Texas Longhorns, and it's not because of Arch Manning. As much as that is a reason for this team to be really good next year, and he will have all the pressure in the world on him, as Anthony was talking about earlier, they're just a really good team. The defense that they're bringing back is absolutely ridiculous. You have Anthony Hill on the interior, one of the best linebackers in the country. Colin Simmons and Trey Moore off the edge is just absolutely ridiculous, along with Ethan Burke, along with a couple of the other guys there. And then Michael Taff on that back end with all the guys they have, with Manny Muhammad, with Derek Williams, with a lot of talent on that defensive side of the ball. I think it could be even better group than it was this year. I think that edge rushing could be the very best group in the entire country. I think the D-line has been proven time and again that they're going to be able to reload at that defensive tackle position, and I think they're going to be more than fine. Now, they are losing Matthew Golden, they're losing Isaiah Bond, they're losing Gunnar Helm. I love what Ryan Wingo brings. I love what DeAndre Moore brings. I also think they're probably going to go into a portal and get a wide receiver coming out of spring. We'll see who that guy is. Could be a couple of big-time names. Could be someone that's more of a supplemental piece. But I love what this Texas team has going into 2025. I think it's going to be a different offense. A little bit more of that quarterback run. Not quite as much as people seem to think right about now, but definitely we'll see a little bit more of that. But more than anything, I think this defense is going to be disgusting. I think it's going to be a little bit better than this year's was. I think that edge rushing is going to be as terrifying as any you will see in the entire country. country, and I think this group is just going to be really, really good as we head into 2025. It won't all be Arch Manning, and it can't all be Arch Manning. If it's all on his shoulders, he is probably going to crumble at some point because he has had some decision-making issues in the first couple of years. That is expected of a young quarterback, but obviously he's going to have to turn a little bit of a corner, especially in that first week against Ohio State, and that's actually something we'll talk about tomorrow. We'll talk about the Week 1 slate for 2025. It is special, no doubt about that. I'll give my final thoughts on the 12-team CFP tomorrow, do a little bit of talking about the Ohio State Ryan Day formula and how it's a little bit different than some people are saying right about now, but thank you so much for tuning in. That'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all the social pages for all the content and updates you could possibly need. We have great people covering every single sport you could want, so anything in the world of sports you need, come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening. We'll be back tomorrow to take another quick look at 2025, but thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys tomorrow.
Let's go.